Now, some people like ads, some people don't, and that's okay. But we like to keep everyone happy. So if you're one of the people who doesn't like to listen to ads, choose the David McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And you can listen to this podcast just the way you like it.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time. It is the eve of Bastille Day. And normally we would not be celebrating this or marking it, but John is going on his holidays to France next week. Exactly. He's going on his holidays to France next week. And of course, France is in the news. So this podcast is going to be another one in our series of our European trips around Europe. And particularly because, we've got Bastille Day tomorrow, but also because France is in turmoil. We're going to talk about France. It's going to be in more turmoil when John arrives next Tuesday afternoon.
Well, I tell you what, I was in turmoil last night. I swear to God, I had a dream about my holiday because clearly I'm looking forward to it. But in my dream, I was driving around in a small little, I think it's one of those bubble cars, but Prigozhin was beside me with a big grumpy head in him, just looking at me. And then, another part of the dream, like it was all disconnected. Prigozhin was at the end of the table.
In his flak jacket.
Big grumpy head in him, looking at me. I woke up and I was in a disarray.
Okay. This is John's Tony Soprano moment, okay? Do you remember Tony Soprano?
Tony Soprano has the podcast on my head.
Tony Soprano would sit down with his shrink. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And he'd have all these mad dreams. John's mad dream is he's driving around France in a Simca. That was the name of the bubble car. It was a French-made bubble car with Yevgeny Prigozhin sitting beside him with a shotgun. Riding shotgun beside you.
I'm going to have to, push him over to change the gear.
Right, okay. If we have any Freudian dream weavers out there, by all means, please drop us a line on Twitter.
He's in my head.
And explain what John's French dream. Okay, well, I wasn't intending to start with your French dream. So you're driving down the Bay of Biscay somewhere, okay? And Prigozhin and yourself are in a Simca. That beats anything Tony Soprano could ever. You're the Tony Soprano podcast, and that's your. Anyway, we're going to talk about things French. I want to start this podcast in July of 1914.
Okay.
3 days before the outbreak of the First World War.
I feel I need music to bring us back.
And we're in France, right?
In France.
Okay. And it's the trial of a woman who's charged with murdering the editor of The Figaro, a conservative newspaper. Not only was she charged with murder, she got off, but the story is brilliant, right? So it goes back to a thing what the French called the Affaire Callot, Caillaux. Now, Monsieur Callot was the French finance minister, right? And he was a devil for having affairs, okay?
Yeah.
Particularly with married women, right? Now, he had an affair with this woman. He then married her, right? This was the year 1913, but he got bored with her by 1914, and he had an affair with another woman, right? And that other woman...
It's all very French.
It's all very, very French. But that other woman, that other married woman, right?
Yeah.
Began to get anxious because Callot tried to increase income tax in 1914. And he was a radical politician, which meant he was on the left. And the conservative newspaper, The Figaro, decided to fight him, not on the area of economics, but by leaking stories about his many mistresses.
Right.
So the new mistress, whose name was Henrietta Clarité, she decided that the only way she could preserve her integrity and...
That was already gone at this stage, surely.
And prevent the newspaper from leaking about her other affairs, right?
I see, yeah.
Was by shooting the editor. So she bought a gun, she blew his head off, right?
Pretty radical.
And the reason this is all interesting is Callot's right-hand man was a guy called Émile Moreau. And Émile Moreau went on to be the governor of the Bank of France, right?
Okay.
And Émile Moreau and Callot were both educated at these technocratic universities in France called the Sciences Po, right? Which is the Institute of Science and Politics. And they were set up after the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, which the French lost. And in reaction to that loss, they said, we need to get our state centralized, producing munitions for the war of revenge, which they called the First World War against the Germans, right?
Okay.
And Morrow was at the center of, he was the banker at the center of this. He was a finance guy at the center of this. But 2 days after the trial, what the French started to see was gold coins started to disappear from France. Now, the reason this happened is that the French have always had this obsession in times of trouble with gold. They actually ended up being the biggest single holder of gold. And why was this? Because do you remember our friend, the South Sea bubble? Remember we talked about, right?
Yeah.
2 things. One was the French Revolution was financed by, remember we talked about Talleyrand? And his assignats, which were paper money, which destroyed the middle class in France because they all bought these assignats and they inflated them away. And prior to that, John Law and the Mississippi bubble, do you remember that one?
Yeah, I remember that too.
Enslaved.
I have my notes here.
Yeah, it's you and Prigozhin. you and Yevgeny discussion. So they've always had this weakness for going to gold when there's a crisis.
Right, okay.
And deep in this is the French technocratic obsession with stability at all costs, right? So what they always do in France, and what they always did up until the euro, was always vouch for austerity, the Bank of France, for austerity type policies, because they are obsessed with, they were and they've always been obsessed with preserving the stability of the state. And this comes from the fact that all the higher anarchs, the higher functionaries, the higher civil servants are all from this Sciences Po thing. And Morrow was one of them. Now, Morrow was the head of the French central bank in the 1920s when they reacted, and the 30s, when they reacted to the Great Depression by raising interest rates and buying gold rather than cutting interest rates and actually expanding the money supply. Jean-Claude Trichet, previous French head of the Central Bank of Europe, the ECB, raised interest rates in 2011 in the face of a crisis. And always in France, you have these insiders who look after themselves and threaten the outsiders. And that's, John, where we're going to start today.
That's really interesting. So was that the kind of thinking behind the development of the euro and the idea of the European Central Bank?
Now, it's fascinating because we started the Franco-Prussian War, right? If you look at the last 150 years history between France and Germany, it has been spectacularly violent prior to the European Union. What you have is you have a consistent thread to French economic thinking, mainly coming from the Bank of France, which is extreme monetarism. You also have a jealousy and a rivalry with Germany, not with Britain, but with Germany.
Right.
And the euro idea came from the fact that when the Berlin Wall collapsed, the Germans decided we're going to go for unification. The French said, no, you're not. The Brits said, no, you're not. The Brits, of course, did the stupid British things. They never extracted anything from the Germans, right? If you think about it, the British did their usual daily telegraph, oh my God, fight them on the beaches sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't extract a deal. The French are much more crafty. And they said to the Germans, look, you can have the unification, but we want your currency.
Yeah.
And the Germans said, what? He said, you see that Deutschmark? You can't have that anymore. We're going to take it over. We're going to Francify the Deutschmark and create this thing called the euro.
Yeah.
And we're going to control it. And has there ever been a German boss of the ECB? No.
Really?
Have there been 2 French bosses in the last 10 years?
Really?
Yes.
Now,
so think about it.
That makes sense.
So you had Trichet, French boss, and you're one now, Lagarde.
Yeah.
Right? So what the French have done is they've managed to
That's curious.
infiltrate
Yeah.
European monetary system with their own people and elbow out the Germans, which goes back to what Andrea was saying last week, that there's a lot of Germans kind of upset about the status quo because they realize that they're paying the bill, but they're not getting the top jobs. It's like RTE.
I know. Now, hang on a second.
So that's what we're going to frame it, right?
Right,
So
excellent.
it's against that background that we discuss France. Insiders, the outsiders, the technologists, the Bank of France, the obsession with austerity, all that sort of stuff. And why don't we go to Marseille this time? And we're going to talk to Shaheen Vallée, who was the economic advisor of Emmanuel Macron. So a fellow who knows what the thinking is at the top. So let's go to Marseille.
Glass of rosé?
Now, we are on the eve of Bastille Day, the day in which the French commemorate and celebrate the revolution, the French Revolution, and all things that goes from that. Many would argue probably the most, or possibly the most consequential event of the last 250 years in European politics in terms of shaping the way we see the world. But as we know, France is in a little bit of turmoil. And as part of our European tour, we're now going to go to France, and we're going to talk to a man who was the economic advisor to Emmanuel Macron. But Shaheen Vallée is probably at the epicenter of European policymaking, was Macron's economic advisor, wrote a fantastic piece in the Financial Times just this week about the French police, the French cops. We're going to kick off there with the riots, and then we're going to ask that question, as we asked in Germany last week, which is who really runs France? So Shaheen, welcome and lovely to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation.
Not at all. Now, tell me, you wrote in the FT last week that the French police force is the problem, or is a significant part of the problem, the riots. Explain to me what your thinking was.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, I mean, how the events of the last couple of weeks have really polarized French society. You have some people on one part of the spectrum who believe that we have a real problem with policing, and that the killing of this young man, the 17-year-old kid, is just, a flashpoint of that deeper institutional problem with policing. And that, the serious riots that we've had in this country were all and every time the result of police brutality. And so, I'm part of these people who believe that we have, a serious problem with the police and that we need to address it. And that many countries in Europe have had similar problems with the police and have addressed it. That's the case of Germany. That's the case of the UK, where you have now much less violent police and as a result, much less homicides by the police. Just, to state some numbers, the French police was killing roughly 10 people a year in 2010. It is now killing between 40 and 50 people a year.
Wow.
Yeah. And Germany, which is a country that is a population that is 20% bigger than France, Germany's police was killing 10 people a year in 2010, and it's still killing, today in 2023, about 10 people a year. So, that says something both about the cross-country differences, but also about how, things have evolved over the last decade or so, and how a number of laws in France have basically, contributed to empower and create a lack of accountability on the part of the police. And I believe that's a big part of the problem. Now, you have another part of the French population which really focuses on the riots and what has happened since, and who says, well, actually the killing is just an excuse. The deeper problem are the profound social tensions at the heart of this country, and that manifest with these riots. And these social tensions, according to these people, are in large part due to immigration, crime, and a lack of ability of the authority of the state to basically discipline these parts of society. I happen to disagree with that, but I have to confess that I think that feeling now is a majority of the French public opinion. And I think these riots have had a very profound and I fear lasting effect on French society and on French politics, in the sense that I think it is creating a feeling of unity in the country around and against a part of the population, which happens to be the, racial minorities and religious minorities of the country. And I fear terribly that this is basically fueling a far-right sentiment and making Le Pen's accession to power far easier than it would have been otherwise.
Well, I want to talk to you about the prospect of President Le Pen, because it's a very real prospect now. Macron is out of the race. He can't go again. He's been there twice. He's a formidable operator. We'll talk about him, but he's out now. And Le Pen is a formidable operator in her own way. And something like this emboldens her, gives her legitimacy, all that sort of. I want to ask you what France would look like under a Le Pen presidency. But I want to come back to you on the psychological impact of the riots before we go deeper on the economy. So do you think that the riots now give a sense of respectability to the right? And do you think, even despite your own politics, that that's kind of maybe understandable?
I don't think it gives them a sense of respectability, but I think it is creating a fear in the French public that the situation is out of control and that the only people who haven't been in power, may be given or should be given a chance to try and put this under control. I'm not particularly sure that people believe that the Front National and Marine Le Pen have a response, but they know that, they haven't been tested yet. And so I think what has happened with this riot and, more profoundly in the country over the last, couple of electoral cycles is that Le Pen has done two very important things that I think has helped her gain respectability. One is that she has more or less abandoned this anti-Euro, anti-Europe discourse, which I think was scaring the majority of the French public. I mean, nobody in France, especially after what has happened in Greece and what has happened in Italy, believes that we can leave the euro and that we would be better off doing that. And so I think our flip-flopping on the euro for a long time was a tremendous liability. And she got rid of that in the 2022 election. And I think that has helped our respectability tremendously. The second thing is I think she's tried to tame her most obviously racist and authoritarian bent. And she was greatly helped in that by having somebody to her right in the person of Éric Zemmour, who was running in 2022.
Yes, this sort of kind of comedian come commentator who kind of deposited it in, and it was actually quite a threat for quite some time to Le Pen.
So in the very beginning of the race, he was a real threat because he appeared more committed, more extreme than her. And so I think she was really troubled by that. But it eventually helped her because it helped normalize her. So basically, Zemmour took her ideas to a new extreme. And as a result, she appeared like a more reasonable person. And a more reasonable person who, you know, a traditional right-wing voter could say, well, you know, she's kind of normalized on the euro and she's actually not as openly racist as Zemmour. So she's actually somebody that I could vote for. So I think the respectability of the far right and the sort of, you know, tacit union between, you know, a portion of the right and the far right has taken place already and is sort of crystallizing now with these riots.
So she's kind of morphing into like a 21st century de Gaulle, almost like a sort of a right-wing French patriot who stands for all good French things, which means Christianity, white France, all those things that de Gaulle stood for. And and of course, people said, well, what do you do in Algeria? Oh, forget about that. We can figure. So she is morphing into the standard bearer of the right, the centre right. And these riots have solidified that position.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about maybe what that presidency might look like at the end before we go. But let's talk about France itself, right? I've always, and we said it in the top of the last discussion we had on Germany, right? Because we speak English in Ireland, we tend to be the recipients of incessant English propaganda against continentals. So the Germans are all caricatures, and in the English press, the French are all caricatures. It's a caricaturization of an entire nation. And one of those things is the French are lazy and they don't work very hard. Now, I was an economist at BNP many, many years ago as a French economist, so I wouldn't share that view. So park that sort of almost trope, cliched view of France and explain to me, how come France remains the fifth largest economy in the world? How come it remains incredibly wealthy? What makes it all tick?
Well, you know, I think these caricature that you refer to, you know, are really missing the point. I think the French economy is a very vibrant economy. It's actually, you know, healthier than many other European economies, including the British and including the German one. It is a lot more diversified. It has, you know, a fairly strong industrial base, even though it has weakened over the years, but it has a very strong service industry. It has made very bold bets, which I think are paying off. One is a big bet on global luxury. The other is a big bet on finance, which, you know, I think for a long time looked like it was not paying off. But in fact, we had some of the largest European and global banks. And I think that contributed quite tremendously to French GDP. And we have a fairly decent employment level, which is actually rising. And I think Macron has played a meaningful role in that, mostly through apprenticeship. So I think on the end, we have probably a smaller demographic challenge than most of other European nations. So on the whole, I think it's an economy that, if it was not for its bad politics, could thrive. I think it is held back by some deeply rooted problems in French politics. One is an extreme level of centralization. And by centralization, I mean both geographical and political. So, you know, unlike Germany, we don't have, you know, 10 cities that are driving the economy. We essentially have one, which is Paris and its surrounding. And that creates a real polarization of resources, which I think is creating real economic, political, and social problems in the rest of the country. And I think these social problems really emerged or exploded rather during the Gilets jaunes movement. I think, you know, people want to see the Gilets jaunes movement as a fight against the carbon tax. And I think that's a very narrow understanding of what the Gilets jaunes movement was. I think the Gilets jaunes movement was more profoundly a revolt of the periphery against the core, and the core being Paris, but more importantly, the French elite, both economic and political. So, you know, if it was not for these political challenges, which when elected in 2017, Macron had promised to address, I think France would be in a great economic and political position. Sadly, I think we're held back by these forces and by, I think, a ruling elite. And by that, I mean, both the economic and the political elite, which has, too much comfort in the current organization of the system, doesn't want to decentralize power, doesn't want to lose grip over economic and political power. And I think as a result is holding back the country. I think we would benefit tremendously from a much more decentralized organization, decentralized or deconcentrated when it comes to economics. I think we would benefit tremendously from having more firms rather than, a country that is driven by, 3 or 4 global firms that are basically calling the shots on every policy and political decision.
I want to come back to the elite, but let's talk about the luxury, because I don't think many people appreciate this, right? That, luxury brands, the LVMHs of this world, the Bernard Arnaults, right? This makes France an unbelievably fascinating sort of, it kind of gets into people's head, brand France.
Yeah.
So last week we were talking about Germany. The Germans, they heat things up and they make things, right?
Yeah.
But France is certainly much more different. It's arguably a more sophisticated economy, because you're an economy that resides in people's imaginations in a way.
Yeah. No, and I think Bernard Arnault is heavily criticized in France, but to be fair, I think he's a marketing genius and has contributed greatly to build the brand France. He benefits also tremendously from the brand.
He's the richest man in the world, so he benefits, obviously.
But he's also contributing to, creating that imagination.
Yeah.
And, we probably owe a significant share of French tourism to the myth and imagination that LVMH is creating globally.
Yeah, no, okay. So let's talk about the elite. Okay, so I was really intrigued many years ago. I studied in Belgium and I did a master's there with many French students. And a lot of them went on, they came from this Sciences Po sort of anarch tradition. And many of them went on into the French Ministry of Finance and the Quai d'Orsay and all that sort of stuff, right? Explain to me the power struggle in France between these technocratic elite that we spoke about, and these are the people I studied with, the industrial elite and the people, the gilets jaunes, if you will.
So there isn't so much of a struggle between the political administrative elite and the business elite, in the sense that these are one and the same people. And by the way, I come from Sciences Po as well. So, I...
Fess up. Yeah. I talked earlier to John about the Sciences Po, but explain to me exactly what it is.
So basically, Sciences Po is a political science school which prepares basically the French elite to then go to another school, which is called the École Nationale d'Administration, which is, in English would be a Master's of Public Affairs or something of that nature. But, imagine a very small class of, 50 individuals a year, which basically after having gone through the school is basically given kind of a right to govern for life. And that right to govern can be exercised in the public sector or in the private sector or in the quasi-public sector, which is the number of French companies that are nominally private, but are in fact run by people who are coming from that school.
Yeah, like BNP when I worked for it. Like BNP was a notionally private bank, but it was very clear to me when I worked there, it was an arm of the French state. I mean, not so much an arm of the French state, but they were very, very proximate in the way in which it wouldn't be the case in other countries.
Yeah, so there's strong social networks. And I think these strong social networks create an important symbiotic relationship between basically top businesses and the French administrative and political elite. I think where it creates a problem is that it basically puts these companies in a much privileged situation and makes competition a lot more difficult, and the emergence of competitors that can challenge the powers of the incumbent a lot more difficult. So I think, to me, the struggle is here. And what you've expressed and asked about, which is the Gilets jaunes movement, I think some of it is that frustration that basically the people at the periphery, and those who are the most marginalized, being the people who were basically on the roundabouts during the Gilets jaunes movement, feel that collusion is working against them. And it's a collusion that is, also geographical, in the sense that these people basically govern from Paris and basically treat the provinces not in the best way.
So it's a sort of a classic, as you'd say in English, kind of an insiders-outsiders situation, where the insiders are constantly reinforcing their position, the outsiders are getting marginalized, the outsiders are paying for the failures of the insiders. It's funny, we're talking about Bastille Day. If you look back, I mean, I don't predict revolution, but if you look back at the Third Estate and then the cardinals and the royalty, I mean, it's not dissimilar in a historical context. I mean, you can't overemphasize it, but it's quite interesting.
No, but every country reproduces a form of oligarchic operation, even under the guise of a perfectly well-functioning democracy. And, France has that to some extent, but, I'm sure Ireland does too, and clearly
Absolutely.
And clearly the UK has it too. So I think I don't want to sound naive about making it feel like this is something unique to France. What is unique to France and is the shape and form it takes. But the idea that elites seek to accumulate and preserve power outside of the structures of the democratic functioning of the country is something that is quite standard and not very surprising.
And then, of course, you drop into the misfortunate migrants, because what you have is a battle for the heart and soul of France. And you drop into a migrant population that is disenfranchised. If you look at, I think it's Arab kids are 8 times more likely to be stopped by the cops, and black kids are 7 times more likely to stop with the cops than white kids. So, you put that racial thing in, and you have massive tensions.
Yeah, I think these tensions also have an historical root. These migrants are here because France was there, right?
Good, fair point.
There is a colonial history. There is a history of importing migrant workers when we needed them. And so, I think it's, while I can understand like a country like Poland who, finds migration something completely foreign to them.
An alien, yeah.
For France, it shouldn't, the reality is that we didn't discover migration 5 years or 10 years ago with the Syrian crisis or with the wave of demographic changes affecting Africa. We've discovered migration
as soon as France went to Africa. Yeah, and as soon as France went to India.
With slavery, with colonization, with decolonization and imported labor. So, this is part of our history. And sadly, I think what's missing to our national sort of founding myth is to include that history as part of our, founding myth. And we've still struggled to do that. And as a result, we struggle to build an inclusive, multicultural society. Because we want to be defined as a society that does not discuss and that does not recognize race and religion. We only want to consider citizens, which is in principle a good idea, I would say, but it can backfire if it leads you to ignore what are the challenges that a multicultural society has to face, what are the challenges of a society that has to face its history. And I think the danger of France's views of universalism or laïcité is that it pushes us to ignore and to accept the fact that you can be French and Muslim, French and Malian, something that, in my experience living in London for a long time is very possible. I think people can define themselves as Nigerian and British. Doing that in the French context is a lot more challenging.
But not Nigerian and English, which is the interesting thing. British is a very good flag of convenience for England, because you can be Jamaican and British, as most Jamaicans feel. They really, really feel that, But let's come back. So France requires you to be secular, to be a citizen of France, to be denuded of ethnicity. You are actually loyal to the French state. Now, for many Europeans, and we go back to the Bastille Day, that looked like an amazingly brilliant way of dealing with different cultures. And for many, many years, it probably was. But what you're saying is now it doesn't work so well. And the prospect of a President LePen is made even closer from the fact that France requires everyone to be the same. And if you're not the same, you stand out. And if you stand out, then you're a target.
Yeah, no, I think on paper, France's notion of citizenship and, rooted in universalism is brilliant. This is what I was taught at school and I came to believe in it. But I think it's ill-suited to a society that is as diverse as France is today, with people, having a longing for a sense of identity lost that I think France must accept and recognize. And I think we'd be much better off if we accepted France's multicultural roots and allowed people to live with them. Yeah. And to some extent, Macron's promise, which I'm going back to him, Macron's promise when he was elected in 2017 was that. He had fought against a very controversial law that Hollande had tried to pass, which failed after the terrible terrorist attack of 2015. Basically, Hollande had proposed to rescind the French citizenship to dual citizens who would be convicted. And this had created a big trauma because it basically meant that dual citizens were not true French citizens. Yeah. And Macron had opposed that. And he made a very big and important speech during his campaign in 2017 in Marseille, where I'm actually speaking to you from today, where he appealed to that multicultural identity, which is very deeply rooted in a city like Marseille, where you have people, it's a port city.
It's an extraordinary
city. It's a city where people come from all of, North Africa and all of Europe. And during that speech, he did something which is very unusual for a French candidate. He said, who in the audience is coming from Mali, and who is coming from Senegal, and who is coming from Algeria? And in doing that, he kind of recognized that you could be both, French from Marseille and Algerian and claim all of these identities together. And in doing that, to me, he basically allowed the beginning of a new definition of French citizenship and French multicultural identity to emerge. But that was, pre-2017, pre his victory. Yeah. And after that, when he was elected, he came back to the old French mold of basically, no, you can only be French. And I don't want to see your color skin. I don't want to see your religion. Even if, by not wanting to see it, I end up ignoring and maybe deliberately ignoring the discriminations that you may suffer from.
So let's conclude this discussion in Marseille. I was at Le Pen's final rally in Marseille, making a documentary about France in 2016. And she kept coming back to this idea, say, on est chez nous, right? They are over in our place. And she was basically talking about Africans and North Africans and Muslims and whatever. And it was in the Hippodrome in Marseille. And it was a particularly unusual crowd, to say the least, right? Now, there was a kind of an understanding that she may well get to the second round, but she's going to lose. What does Europe look like? Because I know you're very involved in Europeans. What does Europe look like under President Le Pen?
So to me, what's interesting is that Le Pen is not an isolated case, not at all. In fact, these changes that I've described of Le Pen have taken place in other countries in Europe. They've taken place in Italy. They're taking place to a lesser extent in Spain. We'll see what the election outcome in Spain in July looks like. But, we basically have the beginning of a coalition between the PP in Spain and Vox. We clearly have a coalition in Italy between Fratelli d'Italia, the really far right of Italy, with Forza d'Italia, which is sort of the center right. We've seen that in a number of countries. So, Le Pen's trajectory to some extent, and what I've described earlier about this collusion taking shape between the right and the far right in France, is not unique. And what I worry about is that I think we have a lurch across Europe that is basically pulling the right and the far right together. It might actually, formalize itself and crystallize during the next European elections in June 2024, where you have more and more chances that basically the EPP, the center-right, the sort of Christian Democratic Parties of Europe, will need the ECR group, the far-right group,
far-right group,
to basically continue to run the European Parliament. So I view what may happen in France in 2027 as sort of the continuation of what is already taking place in a number of countries in Europe. That's the case in Finland. We have, I think, a gradual, slow convergence between the right and the far right, which I find quite concerning. Maybe the only positive thing about this, if you want to see something bright in it.
We always do. Irish people are optimistic by nature.
So I think maybe the optimistic thing about this, which we're seeing in Italy, is that it is also contributing to sort of normalize the far right and basically Europeanize the far right. So Fratelli d'Italia and Meloni, had she come to power 5 years ago, would have been anti-Euro, would have been anti-Europe, would have tried to, argue for leaving the EU. That has gone. And I can't, tell myself whether this is a good or a bad thing, but like the far right, who was profoundly anti-European, has basically discovered that it could be European because there are not enough of them in Europe to basically reshape Europe in their own image. In particular, they are united around this vision of an identity of Europe rooted in whiteness and Christianism. And I think this is something that, is uniting far-right forces in Europe, contributing to giving them a real European project, essentially, fighting the enemy, fighting the migrant, fighting the Muslim, and uniting Europe around our Christian values. Sometimes when they're generous, they talk about Judeo-Christian values, but really what they mean is Christian values.
Shaheen, we will leave it there. I'm just reminding that, the idea of Europe is a very recent one. For over 1,000 years, Europe was referred to as Christendom. That was the actual description, So they're going back to this, and that's fascinating because as you say, you can coalesce around a big idea that's kind of amorphous, historically linked, doesn't seem particularly threatening unless you're not white. And that's what you're saying. That's where I'll go. Listen, fascinating stuff. Shane, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Do you know, it's interesting that...
Prigozhin still in the car.
I dropped him off.
You dropped him off.
He's doing a bit of shopping. I'll
They
pick him
dropped
up
him off in
later.
a place called Belarus. Went on a little detour in your Simca bubble car.
But it's interesting what Shaheen was saying there, that, and what we were talking about in this whole European tour that you're on, you're swanning around.
Funny around.
But about the, and the recurring theme is this rise of the right.
Yes.
And it's also interesting in what he was saying there towards the end about the impact of Brexit on the rise of the right across Europe.
Yeah, no, it is a fascinating thing. So the impact of Brexit, there's many, right? But one of the main impacts was the following, that the right wing in Italy and France were always anti-European. They're patriots first, sovereignty first. The Europeans are meddlers, right? Part of that was, we're going to go back to the lira and we're going to go back to the French franc.
Yeah.
So we're going to abandon the euro, right? Now, that was a sort of a kind of cost-free option for them because it was hypothetical. But then, when the Brits left the EU punished the Brits and said, okay, you can leave, but you can't have any trade deals.
Yeah.
And that, of course, percolated into right-wing thinking in France. And they said, look, leaving the euro, this is part of the whole process of leaving the EU. The Brits couldn't do it. We can't do it. The Italians said the Brits couldn't do it. We can't do it. So it's amazing. European integrationists have a huge amount to thank the Brexiteers for. Because the Brexiteers thought that they would do Brexit and that would lead to the dissolution of the European Union, right? They thought it would lead to a domino effect and people would go out. What it's actually done is it's strengthened the European Union because the incipient risk to the European Union was from the right wing of Italy and, to a degree, Spain and definitely France, right?
Yeah.
Now what Brexit has done is it's actually emasculated the right wing and made them more European. So they've dropped all that anti-European stuff. But, and here's the sort of blowback is, it has also meant that the right wing have seeped some of their ideas into the European Union. So they've actually, the tent has got bigger. The ideas within the tent have become more broad. And so what they're doing
and
now...
normalised.
And normalised. So all the anti-immigration stuff, the anti-Muslim stuff, all that stuff now is becoming part of the background noise.
Yeah.
And as Shaheen said, and we'll probably conclude here, that it gives life to an ancient idea that Europe is white, Christian, and as I was saying to Shaheen, Europe used to be referred to as Christendom.
Yeah.
Right? And all of European politics was, think about the Crusades.
The Holy Roman Empire
the Crusades,
with Charlemagne and stuff.
all that stuff. The Crusades is all about European culture dominating Arab culture. The Saracens and all that sort of stuff. The entire Ferdinand and Isabel stuff in Columban times when they kicked out all the Jews and the Arabs out of Spain, all the same idea. And this now gives Le Pen a new story, and Meloni, and arguably that story's even more scary, that we're all in this together as white Christian Europeans. That's something we haven't talked about for centuries. And they're talking about it now.